May 23, 1944. A grim transit camp sat near Cherbourg, France. The air hung thick with the stench of diesel, the cloying odor of stale fear, and the lingering, terrifying memory of the Normandy beach landings. Obergefreiter Klaus Richter, a 20-year-old infantryman from the 716th Static Infantry Division, clutched a half-eaten hunk of stale bread. His uniform was ripped, his face smeared with the grime of battle, and his mind was a swirling vortex of exhaustion and bone-deep dread. Just days before, he'd been locked in fierce combat, fighting for every inch of hedgerow against the relentless advance of the Canadian forces. Now he stood in a vast mud-caked compound, surrounded by thousands of fellow prisoners, the captured remnants of the Wehrmacht's disastrous defense of the Atlantic Wall. A brusque American sergeant barked out orders, herding them toward the open doors of a waiting train. The prisoners, their boots dragging heavily on the ballast, shuffled into the cramped, windowless boxcars. With a resounding clang, the doors slammed shut, plunging them into absolute darkness. Richter slid down onto the hard, splintered floor, settling next to Corporal Hans Ziegler, a veteran radio operator captured during the desperate retreat from Caen. "They're taking us to England," Ziegler whispered, his voice thick with apprehension. Richter shook his head, the movement tight and weary. "No, too many of us. Rumor has it, it's America, the long haul. I heard stories from the last war. Barbed wire, starvation, hard labor until the war ends. They'll punish us." This fear was a shared burden, carried by every man in the car. German military propaganda had painted a vivid, brutal picture of Allied prison camps, tales of vengeful guards, meager rations that barely sustained life, and cruel retribution for the destruction inflicted by the Reich. They fully expected the worst. The train journey across France was a disorienting blur of starts and stops, the only constants being the relentless rattling of the wheels and the low murmurs of their guards. Finally, days later, they were herded out, blinking against the harsh sunlight onto the docks of a major port, likely Glasgow or a Canadian terminal, though they couldn't be certain. The next leg of their journey would be by sea, a cramped, terrifying voyage aboard a stripped-down transport ship. For 8 days, Richter endured the constant, nauseating roll of the Atlantic, convinced that at any moment a U-boat, perhaps one commanded by a man he knew, would sink their vessel, sending them all to a freezing, watery grave. The irony was almost unbearable. The guards kept their distance, efficient but silent. There was no violence, no overt brutality, but the silence itself was somehow deeply intimidating. Their destination remained a complete mystery. Finally, they arrived. The port was immense, cold and clean, far larger than anything Richter had ever seen in Europe. They were marched directly from the gangplank to another waiting train, an endless ribbon of carriages clearly designed for long-distance travel. The landscape they saw as they moved westward was utterly alien. Vast, untouched forests, glittering blue lakes, and then the endless empty plains that stretched out to an impossibly huge horizon. This was nothing like the cramped, war-torn Europe they knew. After what felt like a lifetime, days blurring into a week on the rails, the train finally ground to a permanent halt. They were somewhere deep in the heart of this colossal, unknown country. Canadian guards dressed in their familiar khaki uniforms stood waiting. Richter, squinting against the harsh continental sun, saw a large wooden sign hammered into a post. The lettering was simple, stark: POW Camp Number 132, Medicine Hat, Alberta, Canada. He braced himself for the shouted commands, the rough shoves, the inevitable confrontation with the barbed wire. But what he saw instead was a sprawling complex that looked less like a fortress of vengeance and more like a tidy, if isolated, village. Yes, there was a perimeter fence of wire, but the atmosphere was calm. Late May 1944, Camp 132, Medicine Hat, Alberta. The gates swung open, and the long column of German prisoners led by Richter and Ziegler marched onto Canadian soil. The first thing that struck Richter was the sheer cleanliness. The dirt pathways were swept clean. The wooden barracks were painted in stark white and green, and the Canadian guards carried their Lee Enfield rifles with a casualness that suggested boredom, not aggression. There were no snarling dogs, no loud aggressive commands. The complex itself was vast, Camp 132, or simply Medicine Hat, as the men would soon call it, was one of the largest prisoner-of-war facilities in Canada. Built to house thousands, it was located far from the coasts and major population centers, partly for security and partly to take advantage of the massive, empty plains of Alberta. The prisoners were processed quickly. Instead of being stripped and aggressively searched, they were given a simple medical check and issued new, durable clothing stamped with a large PW, prisoner of war. During the intake process, Richter encountered an older German soldier, Feldwebel Emil Kreis, who had been captured in North Africa years earlier and recently transferred. Kreis had a strange, almost serene look in his eyes. "Kreis, tell me the truth," Richter whispered urgently. "What is this place? Is this just a staging ground before they send us to the coal mines?" Kreis smiled, a slow, tired expression. "They will send you to work, Richter, but not in a mine. Look around you. The guards here, they barely speak, but they treat us by the book, the Geneva Convention." This was Richter's second shock. The guards strictly adhered to the international agreements governing the treatment of prisoners of war. German officers retained their rank and privileges, receiving officers' rations and avoiding mandatory labor. Enlisted men like Richter and Ziegler were required to work, but the conditions and pay were entirely unexpected. After being assigned their quarters, a surprisingly spacious, heated barrack shared with 20 other men, the prisoners began to settle in. The quality of life was immediately evident. 3 regular, if plain, meals a day, sufficient heat, clean bedding, and even a small library stocked with German books, provided by the Canadian YMCA. "This isn't a prison," Ziegler muttered one evening, staring out the window at a group of their comrades playing soccer in the enclosed yard. "This is a strange holiday camp." The Canadians, however, had a motive beyond simple humanitarianism. The massive demand for food production during the war meant that Canadian agriculture was severely short-handed. Millions of acres of wheat, sugar beets, and vegetable crops lay fallow or risked rotting in the fields. The solution was obvious: use the captive workforce. The POWs at Camp 132 would become the temporary, invisible backbone of the prairie labor force. A few days later, a Canadian officer, Captain MacDonald, addressed the assembled enlisted prisoners. He explained the system. They would be offered work details on surrounding farms, particularly harvesting the immense sugar beet crops. "You will be paid," MacDonald stated flatly, causing a ripple of confused murmurs among the prisoners. "According to the scale set by the convention, 50 cents a day. You will not receive Canadian dollars, but script, special coupons redeemable only inside the camp's canteen for things like cigarettes, stationery, and extra luxuries." The prospect of working for real money, or something approaching it, was revolutionary. In Germany, they were used to constant shortages and austerity. Here they were being paid to work the land. The first assignment for Richter and Ziegler was a local farm miles outside the main camp perimeter, protected only by a token armed guard. The true nature of this secret prison was about to be revealed. June 1944. A sugar beet farm outside Medicine Hat, Alberta. The drive out to the fields was surreal. Richter, Ziegler, and a dozen other enlisted prisoners sat in the back of an open Canadian Army truck. The surrounding prairie was breathtakingly vast, golden in the early morning light. Their guard, a grizzled reservist named Sergeant McIntyre, sat casually in the passenger seat, his rifle resting across his lap, seeming more interested in the passing scenery than his high-value captives. When they arrived at the farm, they were met by the owner, a stout, weathered man named Mr. Henderson. He managed to communicate the nature of the labor, the back-breaking task of thinning and weeding the endless rows of sugar beets, mostly through energetic gestures and broken German phrases learned from local immigrants. The work was indeed grueling, conducted under the fierce Alberta sun, but the routine was instantly recognizable and familiar to the former soldiers, many of whom came from rural backgrounds. It was honest, productive work, far removed from the senseless violence of the trenches. What truly shocked the prisoners, however, was the treatment they received from the civilians during their midday break. Mrs. Henderson, a kind-faced woman with flour dusting her apron, emerged from the farmhouse. She didn't bring the bare minimum rations expected of prison labor. Instead, She brought thick sandwiches, jugs of cold water, and slices of warm, freshly baked pie. Richter hesitated, looking nervously at Sergeant McIntyre, who simply shrugged and started eating his own lunch. "Schnell, young eat, boys," McIntyre said simply. "She's not giving it to you because she likes Nazis. She's giving it to you because you're working hard, and she knows what good field labor needs." This humanization, this unexpected generosity from the enemy civilian population, dismantled years of propaganda in a single afternoon. These farmers, whose families had struggled to build lives on this harsh land, saw not ideological enemies, but simply young men capable of productive labor. They offered basic decency. In the ensuing weeks, this pattern solidified. The prisoners, eager to earn their script for the camp canteen, where they could buy highly desired items like real pipe tobacco and chocolate, worked diligently. They were often left largely unsupervised, sometimes working alongside elderly or young members of the farmer's family. The proximity to freedom was immense. The perimeter of the work zone was imaginary, defined only by the honor of the Geneva Convention and the promise of fair treatment. Richter, realizing he could simply walk away into the endless prairie, found himself asking why he would want to. "We could be free, Hans," Richter whispered to Ziegler one hot afternoon as they weeded the rows. Ziegler grunted, wiping sweat from his brow. "Free to walk 1,000 miles across a country we don't know, in stolen clothes with no food, hunted by people who have fed us pie. And then what? We're paid here, we have a bed, we're not shot at, and the war is still going on. This is better than the Eastern Front." The conditions were so humane, the work so productive, and the pay and valuable canteen script so motivating that the escape rate from Camp 132 and its satellite work sites was negligible. The Canadians had discovered a revolutionary principle, that treating your enemy with respect, governed by adherence to international law, created a disciplined, cooperative, and effective workforce. The shock on the faces of new arrivals like Richter and Ziegler was always the same. This was not a punitive prison. It was a functioning, highly efficient labor center where decency was the unwritten rule. Summer 1944, Camp 132 Canteen, Medicine Hat. The heart of Camp 132's internal economy was the canteen. It was here that the script, the special coupons earned by the enlisted men, changed hands for small but meaningful luxuries. The air inside the canteen was thick with tobacco smoke and the low buzz of commerce. Klaus Richter approached the counter, pulling a worn wad of script from his pocket. After weeks of backbreaking labor-thinning beats, his hands were calloused, but his morale was surprisingly high. 2 packs of players and that tin of cocoa powder, Richter instructed the fellow prisoner serving behind the counter. The Canadian authorities allowed the prisoners to manage the canteen, further empowering them and instilling a sense of responsibility. The goods available, genuine, high-quality Canadian-manufactured items, were intoxicating. Cigarettes, chocolate, shaving cream, stationery, and even German newspapers flown in from neutral countries. These small comforts represented a semblance of normalcy and dignity, something they hadn't experienced since before the war began. The work program was a massive success for Canada. By the end of 1944, thousands of German POWs in Alberta were performing critical labor, often surpassing the output of local civilian workers. Their presence alleviated a crippling labor shortage in agriculture, directly supporting the Allied war effort. But the moral question remained: what did this humane treatment do to the prisoners' loyalty? The internal dynamic of the camp was complex. The officers, who were forbidden from working under the Geneva Convention, often maintained a stricter line of discipline and unwavering loyalty to the Reich. They resented the enlisted men's willingness to work for the enemy and sometimes even imposed punishments or social exclusion on men who were deemed too cooperative. However, the experience of the enlisted men working outside the wire created a profound shift. Hans Ziegler summarized the growing sentiment one evening while they shared a smoke outside their barrack. "When we left France, I thought the war would end with me starving behind barbed wire," Ziegler said, inhaling deeply. "Instead, I'm paid more than I was in the Wehrmacht. I eat better, and I'm not freezing in a foxhole." He paused, crushing the cigarette butt carefully. "The Canadians treat us with Early kite honesty. They follow the rules. They treat us like men who must work, not like animals to be punished. The propaganda back home told us the Allies were beasts, Richter added. They lied to us about everything, Hans. About the war, about the enemy, even about the conditions of our surrender. This realization that the enemy was adhering to an ethical standard that their own government had long discarded caused a massive ideological rift. The prisoners were receiving first-hand experience of the democratic ideals they had been taught to despise. As the war turned decisively against Germany in 1945, the humane treatment provided by Canada became a life raft, not just physical but psychological. For many, the simple act of being paid, of being treated with respect by the local farmers, and of surviving the war in relative comfort fostered an emotional connection to this vast, peaceful land. The end of the war was rapidly approaching, and for the men of Camp 132, the prospect of returning to a shattered, occupied Germany was terrifying. They had seen the alternative. May 8, 1945, Camp 132, Medicine Hat, Alberta. The news hit Camp 132 with a strange mixture of relief and uncertainty. Germany had formally surrendered. The war in Europe was over. The silence that followed the announcement was profound, a silence that marked not a victory, but the profound end of a life they knew. For Klaus Richter and Hans Ziegler, the immediate fear of combat was replaced by a paralyzing question. What now? Under international law, all German POWs were to be swiftly repatriated. However, Canada's need for agricultural labor had not disappeared. In fact, it was more urgent than ever as the global demand for food soared. For months following the surrender, the prisoners remained in Canada, still working the fields, albeit with the understanding that their time was limited. The Canadian government faced a unique challenge. They had thousands of disciplined, experienced, and highly effective workers. Many of these men, like Richter, had already spent a year adapting to the Canadian climate and way of life. More critically, thousands of the former POWs were openly expressing a desire not to return to Germany. "I have nothing left there," Ziegler told Richter one evening, looking out over the vast, untouched prairie that now felt like home. "My village is gone. My family is scattered. Here I have a skill, I have a place to sleep, and I was treated honorably. Why would I volunteer to return to ruin?" This sentiment was widespread. The kindness shown by the local farmers, the dignity of the script payment, and the sheer contrast between the peace of Alberta and the devastation of Europe had fundamentally changed their worldview. The Canadian government began a slow, measured process of repatriation. Most prisoners, particularly officers loyal to the old regime or those with strong family ties, were eventually shipped back. However, the path was carefully smoothed for thousands of others. The mechanism was complex but effective. Former POWs could not simply immigrate immediately after being released, but by placing them in displaced person status or through special programs designed to re-engage former POWs for temporary work while they cleared legal hurdles, Canada created a loophole. Former prisoners were given opportunities to work in crucial labor-intensive sectors, effectively keeping them in the country legally until they could formally apply for immigration. The farmers who had grown dependent on the German labor force vouched for them, provided references, and often guaranteed their employment. Men like Klaus Richter and Hans Ziegler saw their chance. They embraced the transition from prisoner to temporary resident, and eventually to immigrant. They settled across the prairies and beyond, becoming vital parts of the communities that had once held them captive. The story of Camp 132 and the other Canadian POW camps stands as a testament to the power of humane treatment, even toward those who fought against you. By strictly adhering to the Geneva Convention, by paying their enemy invaluable script, and by respecting their human dignity, Canada did more than just secure its vital food supply. It won over thousands of future citizens. The war ended, the walls came down, and those former soldiers, many of whom arrived expecting barbarity, chose to stay in the land that paid them real money for honest work, a profound legacy of decency forged behind simple barbed wire in the heart of the Canadian West.